Walter Grady, 66, had become a quiet fixture on the cracked sidewalks of Brooklyn. Each morning began the same. He would stir from beneath a threadbare blanket behind the shuttered doorway of an old furniture store, rise slowly to his feet, and sling an olive-green military backpack over one shoulder. The pack was regulation issue, frayed at the seams, faded with years of use, but still intact. It had once carried rations and ammunition through deserts. Now it carried aluminum cans, dented plastic bottles, and a pair of gloves with holes worn into the fingertips. He had been walking the same routine for over a decade, moving from alley to alley, careful to rotate where he slept so that no one shop owner felt burdened by his presence. Some of the locals called him Ghost Walter, not out of malice, but because of how easily he faded into the cityscape. He never asked for money. Never raised his voice. Never made a scene. He was the kind of man you passed without seeing. Walter hadn't always been a ghost. Before the silence, before the streets, there had been uniformed years. He had served 21 years in the U.S. Army, logistics and transportation. He was good at the details, trusted with the movement of supplies and men across dangerous terrain. His last rank had been staff sergeant, and his discharge was honorable. He came home in 2004. Then came the harder fight. In 2008, his wife, Margaret, began coughing. The VA hospital said it was bronchitis. It wasn't. By the time they realized it was cancer, it had already begun to spread. Margaret died before spring. The house emptied itself afterward, of her scent, her laughter, and finally, of Walter. He sold the apartment. Gave the money to a hospice foundation she'd once spoken kindly of. Then he walked away. Sometimes it's easier to be nobody than to be the somebody who failed the one they loved most. That thought had lived in Walter's mind like a heartbeat ever since. On a particularly brutal November afternoon, with the sky low and gray like a shuttered eyelid and frost creeping into his joints, Walter found himself standing outside Morelli's Corner Market. He hadn't eaten in 3 days. His fingers were stiff from the cold. His knees ached from sleeping on concrete. There was a fatigue in him that food alone wouldn't cure, a deeper hollowing that came from years of endurance without relief. Inside the market, the heater buzzed warmly. He stepped in, careful not to track too much snow onto the linoleum. His eyes scanned the narrow aisles, not for things he wanted, but for things he could carry. The back rack had a loaf of bread, marked down because of its date. It was firm. Cold. But it was food. His hand moved almost involuntarily. He slid the loaf beneath his coat, zipped it as far as it would go, and turned toward the door. He didn't hear the old mirrors creak. Didn't see Mr. Morelli's narrowed eyes behind the register. "Hey! Stop right there." Walter turned, slowly. Mr. Morelli reached for the phone, shaking with more frustration than fear. "I'm calling the cops," he said loudly. Walter didn't protest. Didn't argue. He just stood, his shoulders slightly hunched, the loaf clearly visible beneath the broken zipper. "I just needed strength to live one more day," he said quietly. He didn't speak the words with defiance or pity. Just fact. The store owner didn't respond. 2 officers arrived within 10 minutes. Snow had begun to gather in little heaps along the sidewalk. The older officer moved with practiced weariness, while the younger, Officer Jenkins, his badge red, hesitated when he saw the man standing so still, hands open at his sides. Walter wore dog tags. Old ones. The metal worn smooth in places from years of pressing against his chest. "You really a vet?" Jenkins asked, watching the man's eyes. Walter nodded. "I used to be someone useful." "Not anymore." Jenkins paused, long enough to think. Then the older officer nudged him forward. "Gotta take you in, sir," Jenkins said, more softly this time. Walter didn't resist. As the cuffs clicked around his wrists, the loaf of bread slid to the floor and came to rest against his boot. At the precinct, the warmth of the holding area didn't reach Walter. He sat silently on a bench in the intake room. His belongings, the battered backpack, the plastic bag of bottles, were left in a bin. A public defender gave him 5 rest minutes. A name, a charge, a date. Nothing more. No one asked him why. The court date was set for the next morning. Brooklyn's municipal courtroom was busy as always, overworked clerks, tired attorneys, and judges plowing through cases like weeds in a garden. Walter stood out only because he didn't speak unless spoken to. He was brought in wearing the same wrinkled clothes from the night in holding. No family waited. No friends. No curious onlookers. Just rows of bored people waiting their turn. Case number 47293. State versus Walter Grady, the court clerk announced. The prosecutor, barely older than Jenkins, stood and adjusted his tie. Your Honor, he began, the defendant was observed stealing a loaf of bread from a local market. Due to his prior history of minor infractions and his lack of fixed residence, we recommend continued detention pending trial. Judge Michael Carmichael barely looked up from the file. He flipped through the papers lazily, then stopped. Walter Edward Grady. Former Staff Sergeant. United States Army. His voice trailed off. The courtroom quieted slightly, sensing the shift. The judge's brow furrowed as he reread something in the file. His knuckles whitened slightly around the manila folder. His eyes moved from the paper to the man standing before him, thin, tired, hands folded calmly in front of him. The judge's hands trembled just a little. Then he stood. No one in the courtroom moved. Judges don't stand during arraignments. Court will recess for 15 minutes, he said abruptly. The defendant will remain. The gavel struck once, and Judge Carmichael disappeared into his chambers. The clerk blinked. The prosecutor frowned. Walter remained where he was, unmoving. He didn't know why the judge had stood up. He only knew that something had shifted, like the sky before a snowstorm, like the silence before a salute. 15 minutes can stretch into a lifetime when you're waiting for judgment. Walter remained in the courtroom, silent and still. The bench was cold against his back. His hands, though uncuffed, stayed resting in his lap as if memory still held them bound. Around him, murmurs fluttered like moths beneath the fluorescent lights. Some people wondered aloud why the judge had left so abruptly. Others shrugged and returned to their phones. But Walter heard none of it. He was back in another room, another kind of waiting, an army tent on the edge of Kandahar, waiting for word on a convoy lost to the dust and heat. Or a hospital hallway, the moment before the doctor said, "We did everything we could." That kind of stillness. That kind of breathless dread. Behind the courtroom walls, Judge Carmichael sat heavily at his desk. The chamber door clicked shut behind him. He didn't reach for his gavel. He didn't reach for the file. Instead, he opened the bottom drawer and pulled out an old photograph, bent at the corners. It showed a line of soldiers standing in front of a Humvee, their uniforms sun-bleached and dusty, eyes squinting under a relentless sun. Near the center stood a younger version of himself, Lieutenant Michael Carmichael, his arms slung over the shoulder of a stocky sergeant whose face still burned in his memory. Walter Grady. He hadn't seen him in over 20 years. And yet, here he was, worn thin by time, the same man who had once lifted Carmichael from a burning vehicle and carried him 2 miles through hostile terrain to safety. Back then, Walter had only grunted when praised. No one left behind, he'd said. Nothing more. No ceremony. No applause. Back then, Carmichael had promised himself he'd never forget that face. But life blurred faces. Faces and debts. Until now. He turned to his computer and accessed the military database. It took only a few keystrokes to confirm what he already knew. 3 tours. A Bronze Star. Multiple commendations for valor and leadership. And then a red flag note from the VA, loss of spouse. Declined further psychological services. Record suspended 2009. No pension collection. No known address. No follow-up. He closed the file and stood, staring at the closed blinds on his window. Snow was falling, he could sense it, even if he couldn't see it. A quiet kind of snow, the kind that buried streets in silence. He returned to the bench. The courtroom stirred as he entered. He didn't sit. "Bring Mr. Grady forward," he said simply. Walter approached, steady despite the tension. Judge Carmichael looked at him for a long moment. Then he spoke, voice even but changed, less judicial, more human. "Mr. Grady, how do you plead to the charge of petty theft?" Walter hesitated, then replied with the same quiet he'd used in the market. "Guilty, Your Honor." A snicker came from the gallery. The judge's gaze cut toward it, sharp, final. Silence returned. "I've reviewed the record," Judge Carmichael said slowly, "and I believe the charge is accurate." He paused. "But I also believe context matters. And sometimes, justice demands more than punishment." A breathless quiet settled over the room. "Mr. Grady is a decorated veteran," the judge continued. "A man who served his country with distinction, saved lives, and then, after a personal tragedy, disappeared into the margins of this city. Not because he broke the law, but because the world broke him." Walter said nothing. His expression didn't change. The judge reached beneath the bench and retrieved a sealed envelope. He handed it to the bailiff. "In this envelope is a letter addressed to the New York Veterans Assistance Fund, requesting immediate housing, medical care, and psychological services for Mr. Grady, to be expedited under judicial recommendation." He turned back to Walter. "I am dismissing the charges. You are free to go." A murmur ran through the gallery, disbelief, approval, confusion. The judge's gavel struck once. Case closed. But the story didn't end in the courtroom. Outside, the snow had thickened, laying clean white over the dirty sidewalks. Walter stepped out with the envelope clutched gently in one hand. Officer Jenkins was waiting nearby. He approached, hesitant. I saw the flag on your jacket," Jenkins said, motioning toward the military patch barely visible beneath Walter's coat. "My brother's over in Syria. I didn't know who you were yesterday." "I'm sorry." Walter nodded once. Not in forgiveness, but in understanding. Jenkins reached into his own coat pocket and pulled out a thermos, scratched, dented, clearly used. "Hot coffee," he offered. "You'll need it." Walter accepted it with both hands. That night, a photograph began to circulate quietly on a veterans forum. It showed an elderly man in a torn coat sipping from a thermos while sitting on the steps of the courthouse, snow falling gently around him. The caption read, "Staff Sergeant Grady. Found." It was posted by Judge Carmichael. No hashtags. No fanfare. Just a line of text beneath it. "Sometimes the battlefield follows you home. But so do those who remember." For the first time in years, Walter didn't sleep beneath the doorway. That night, he was given a room at a small transitional shelter on Atlantic Avenue, funded in part by a quietly growing coalition of veterans who'd read about him online. The bed was simple. The sheets clean. On the nightstand sat a cup of warm broth and a paper packet of pain relievers. Nothing extravagant. But to Walter, it might as well have been a palace. He didn't speak much. Not to the intake staff, not to the counselor who introduced herself the next morning. But he accepted the shower. He accepted the fresh clothes. When they offered him a pair of boots that actually fit, he ran a calloused hand down the worn leather of his old pair and whispered goodbye before setting them aside. The envelope from Judge Carmichael remained unopened for a full day. When he did open it, it contained a handwritten letter alongside the service referral. Just a few lines. No dramatic language. Only, you didn't fail anyone. Least of all her. You honored her in every step you took after. Now let others take a few steps for you. There was no signature. But the initials MC were enough. Walter placed the letter inside the front pocket of his new coat. He would later reinforce the pocket with thread to make sure the paper never slipped out. The court records were sealed the following week. And yet, somehow, word continued to spread. A law student named Clara, who had interned at the court, posted a story online, just a few paragraphs, beginning with the line, "Today I saw a judge rise for a man no one else had seen." People began sharing it. Slowly. Then quickly. Within days, a group of younger veterans created a support page called Eyes Open for Walter, dedicated to finding and assisting former servicemen and women lost to the streets. On its homepage, a quote, "It is not weakness to fall. Only silence to leave someone there." Walter didn't know about the page for weeks. He had no phone. No access to the internet. His days were structured now: breakfast at 8, check-ins, appointments, a short walk in the park if the weather allowed. He carried a list of names and numbers in his coat pocket and had learned to ask for help without shame, though the words always came like gravel across his tongue. It was during one of those quiet walks, a month after the court date, that a boy approached him. 12, maybe 13. A too large hoodie. Wide eyes. "You're the guy who saved the judge in the war," the boy said plainly. Walter blinked, confused. "My uncle said you carried him through fire." "That true?" Walter paused, then nodded. The boy didn't cheer or gawk. He just sat next to him on the bench. "I think that's cool," he said. They sat in silence for several minutes. When the boy left, he handed Walter a folded note. Inside was a pencil sketch, rough, amateurish, of a soldier carrying another over his shoulder, both surrounded by smoke. Walter stared at it for a long time. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the same coat pocket as the judge's letter. In the second month, a new outreach worker arrived at the shelter. Her name was Denise Holt. Early 40s, eyes that had seen too much. She recognized Walter the moment she walked in. Her father had served under him during their first tour in Afghanistan. Her father, Sergeant Holt, had been the one Walter pulled from a collapsed supply depot after an airstrike. He'd survived, but never walked again. Walter didn't remember names anymore. But he remembered that mission. The smoke. The blood. The torn dog tag. Denise sat with him one morning, coffee in hand. She showed him an old photo. A man in a wheelchair, flanked by his daughter in a graduation gown. "He said he wouldn't be here if it weren't for you." Walter's eyes dropped. He tried to wave it off. But Denise continued. "He passed last year. Cancer. But he asked me to find you. Said if I ever saw you again, I should tell you, you were the kind of leader others whispered about, long after the fighting stopped." Walter didn't reply. But he took the photo. Added it to the same coat pocket. The pocket now held 3 items: a letter, a sketch, and a memory. The shelter staff began to notice something subtle. Walter stood straighter. His gait, while slow, became more deliberate. He spoke more often. Not much, but enough to be heard. When a younger vet broke down one evening in the cafeteria, Walter walked over and sat beside him. Said nothing. Just placed a hand on his shoulder. That was all the boy needed. At the Brooklyn courthouse, Judge Carmichael had a new plaque mounted near the entrance. Simple brushed steel. No dramatic wording. It read, "To those who fought, and then fought again. Dedicated to Staff Sergeant Walter Grady, U.S. Army, Ret." He didn't invite the press. No ceremony. But Walter's name was there now, in the same building where he once stood in silence, accused of stealing a loaf of bread. In a quiet part of Prospect Park, a bench was engraved by the city with permission from the Parks Department. On its backrest, in small lettering, "Sometimes, a loaf of bread is the weight of a man's final courage." Walter visited it once. Sat down. Ran his fingers along the words. He didn't cry. But something in his face softened, like thawing ice. Not everyone knew what had happened. But those who mattered did. And for the first time in many winters, Walter wasn't just a man passing through. He was seen. He was remembered. And he was no longer walking alone. Winter slowly gave way to spring. The city thawed in its usual hurried rhythm, sidewalks cracking beneath new roots, steam rising from grates like sighs from deep beneath the surface. Walter remained in Brooklyn, though not in the shadows. The shelter became temporary, then unnecessary. With the help of the Veterans Network, he moved into a small studio apartment overlooking a modest park. It wasn't much, peeling paint, a faucet that leaked, but it had a door that locked and a bed that belonged to no one else. Every morning, he walked the same circuit through the neighborhood. He greeted no one first, but if someone nodded, he nodded back. And always, in the left chest pocket of his coat, the one he had stitched himself, the folded sketch, the photo of Holt, and the judge's letter rested against his heart. What he didn't know was how far his story had traveled. The online post about him, the judge who stood up, the dismissal, and the quiet dignity of a man just trying to eat, it had spread well beyond Brooklyn. It reached law schools and homeless shelters, VA hospitals and military reunions. In one high school civics class in North Dakota, a teacher printed the story and taped it above the whiteboard. "Courage doesn't retire." That was the handwritten quote beneath it. One afternoon, Walter received a letter, the real kind, mailed with a stamp. It was from a young corporal stationed overseas. It read, in tight handwriting, "I was going to give up. But then I heard about what you did. How you lived. And I figured, if you could survive the silence, so can I. Thank you." Walter didn't reply. But he added the letter to the others. The pocket grew heavier, and that weight grounded him. That same month, the Brooklyn Veterans Center opened a new wing, one dedicated to reintegration, especially for those who had disappeared into the cracks of society. They named it the W.E. Grady Room. No ribbon cutting. No cameras. Just a small brass plaque and a clean chair near the window. And it sat a replica of the bench inscription. "Sometimes, a loaf of bread is the weight of a man's final courage." Once a week, Walter visited the center. Not as a client, but as someone who simply showed up. Sat down. Drank coffee with the others. Said a few words when asked. One day, a boy entered, no older than 19, nerves dancing in his fingertips. He wore his uniform too stiffly, spoke too quickly. Walter recognized the look. The boy was holding everything too tightly, afraid it would all fall apart if he didn't. Walter waited. Then he walked over. Sat beside him. Opened his coat pocket. From it, he pulled the sketch, now worn soft by time, and placed it gently on the table. The boy stared. "Is that you?" he asked. Walter gave the smallest nod. The boy said nothing more. But the tension left his shoulders. Sometimes, the strongest thing a man can do is simply stay seated when someone else arrives afraid. Word spread again. This time not from courtrooms or internet posts, but from veterans' mouths, spoken at kitchen tables, and recovery groups, on benches in front of shelters. He's the one who never stopped walking. He never asked for anything. Just a loaf. Just a little strength. The judge stood for him. You don't forget something like that. At Morelli's Market, the scene of that frozen November day, a small framed photograph appeared near the register. It showed Walter, seated on the courthouse steps with a thermos, snow falling lightly around him. Beneath it was a single sentence. "If you have enough to take more than you need, remember someone once risked everything for just a crust." Mr. Morelli never admitted to putting it there. But when asked about it, he only muttered, "People change." Or they should. By late spring, the judge retired. Quietly. No gala, no speeches. But before he left, he had a flag sent, not to a courthouse, not to a museum, but to Walter's small apartment. Folded crisply. Accompanied by one line on a note card. "For service in silence. For saving a man who was lost long before the fire." Walter placed the flag on a shelf near the window. That night, he walked to the park and sat on the bench that bore his memory in metal. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. A few children played nearby. One of them, a small girl, walked up and stared at him for a moment. "Are you the man in the picture?" she asked. Walter looked at her and smiled, not with his mouth, but with something softer behind his eyes. "I was," he said. She offered him a flower, a crumpled dandelion. He took it and placed it in the pocket with the others. A fourth wait. That night, in a city that never truly sleeps, a man who had once been forgotten rested in peace. Not because he had riches. Not because of recognition. But because he had left behind something no system, no courtroom, no enemy could erase, a trail of quiet courage, marked not in medals, but in moments. In a plaque. In a pocket. In a loaf of bread. Kindness without question is enough.